1. Introduction. What was the slave trade? The slave trade was one of the darkest periods in human history. It involved the forced capture, transportation, and sale of millions of African people, mainly between the 15th and 19th centuries. This system became known as the transatlantic slave trade, because it crossed the Atlantic Ocean. At its core, the slave trade was driven by greed, economic expansion, and power. European nations needed cheap labor to grow their wealth, especially in the Americas. 2. Early forms of slavery. Slavery did not begin with the Atlantic slave trade. It existed for thousands of years in different parts of the world, including Africa, Europe, and Asia. However, earlier forms of slavery were often not based on race. Sometimes temporary, allowed some social mobility. The transatlantic slave trade was different because it became racialized and permanent, meaning African people and their descendants were treated as property for life. 3. European exploration and expansion. In the 1400s, European countries like Portugal and Spain began exploring the African coast. They were searching for gold, spices, trade routes. During these explorations, they made contact with African kingdoms. At first, trade was peaceful and involved goods like cloth, metal, and ivory. But soon, the demand for labor in the New World, the Americas, changed everything. 4. The rise of plantation economies. When Europeans colonized the Americas, they created large farms called plantations. These plantations grew crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton. These crops required a huge labor force. Indigenous people were first used, but many died due to disease and harsh conditions. This created a demand for a new source of labor, and Africa became the target. 5. The beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. By the 1500s, Europeans began forcibly taking Africans across the Atlantic. The system developed into what is known as the triangular trade. Europe sent goods, guns, alcohol, textiles, to Africa. Africa sent enslaved people to the Americas, Middle Passage. The Americas sent raw materials back to Europe. This system made European nations extremely wealthy. 6. Role of African kingdoms. It's important to understand that some African leaders and traders were involved in the slave trade. They captured people from rival groups, sold them to European traders. However, this happened under pressure, manipulation, and growing European demand. Over time, the system became destructive to African societies. 7. The Middle Passage. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was called the Middle Passage, and it was brutal. Enslaved people were packed tightly into ships, given little food or water, subjected to disease and violence. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did were sold in markets in the Americas. 8. Life in slavery. Once in the Americas, enslaved people were treated as property. They worked long hours on plantations, faced punishment and abuse, were separated from their families. Despite this, many resisted through rebellions, cultural preservation, escape attempts. 9. Expansion and impact. Over time, millions of Africans were enslaved. The slave trade enriched European economies, devastated African communities, built the foundation of economies in the Americas. It also created lasting racial inequalities that still affect the world today. 10. Conclusion. The slave trade began as part of global exploration and economic expansion but quickly became a system of exploitation and suffering. Understanding its origins helps us learn from history, recognize injustice, build a more equal future.